I mean, one of the smartest guys in the world was William F. Albright at Johns Hopkins University. And before he died, he wrote that every book of the New Testament was written by a baptized Jew sometime between the 40s and the 80s of the first century, and probably about 50 to 75.
Yeah.
Okay? Well, if Jesus died at 30, okay, that means within 20 to 35 years, these books that we have now were on the newsstands around Jerusalem, all right? People could read them, and those people that read them were both pro and con, people that loved Jesus and people that hated Jesus. The ones that loved Jesus would look at those documents to make sure that it was absolutely perfect. This is what they remember. And the guys that hated Jesus, they'd have done the same thing because they wanted to prove that these guys were wrong. All right, you interviewed Craig Evans, a great scholar at Acadia Divinity School in Canada. And the fact is, he said that Thomas should be dated between 175 to 200.
Right.
That's 100 years down the pike from where the Gospels are at.
Oh, yeah.
And some of the reasons, explain these. Thomas has too much New Testament in it.
Yeah, exactly. One of the interesting things is that Thomas makes enough references and allusions and enough wording and so forth to show that he is familiar, whoever wrote it was familiar with most of the New Testament. Well, as Evans points out, you can't find any document that knows that much of the New Testament that's written before at least 150 A.D. Plus the fact it uses later forms. In other words, Mark was not the smoothest writer in the world, the Gospel of Mark. He wasn't that great as a writer. So Matthew and Luke would sort of polish his writing a little bit when they would produce their Gospel. Well, it's those later polished versions that we find in Thomas, not the earlier version. Plus we find allusions in Thomas to the Gospel of John, which scholars would tell you was the last one that was written among the four Gospels we have in the Bible. But, John, the most interesting stuff has come up in recent years, the connection between the Gospel of Thomas and the Syriac Church. And here's the connection. The Gospel began to spread. It didn't get to Syria until 175 A.D. And it didn't come in the forms of the four Gospels we know. A guy named Tatian developed a new gospel. What he did is he harmonized the four Gospels and wrote one narrative. And in doing so, he kind of changed the forms and kind of put it in his own language a bit. And he created a thing called the Diatessaron, the blending of the four Gospels. That's what Syria got. Now, what's interesting is we see some of those forms from the Diatessaron in the Gospel of Thomas. Plus, the only place in the world that called Thomas Judas Thomas was in Syria. And that's what this gospel is called. What's more, and this was a fascinating discovery, Thomas is composed of 114 sayings. They look totally random. They look disconnected. And if you translate them in different languages, they're still disconnected until you translate it into Syriac. And when you do, what you see is about 500 catchwords. In other words, words that are repeated to link together these 114 sayings to help people memorize them in order. Well, what does that tell you? That tells you this is something that is a product of the Syriac Church, which didn't get the gospel until 175 A.D. What's more, they had their own take on things. They didn't like commercialism. They didn't like business people and so forth. And you see those biases represented in Thomas as well. So all of this adds up, John, I think, to a conclusive case that Thomas was written between 175 and 200 A.D., most likely closer to 200 than to 175.
Yes.
And therefore, historically speaking, it does not carry the weight at all that we see in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which are right back there, rooted in eyewitness testimony, right there in the first century.
Yeah, so the Jesus of Thomas is 100 years down the pike, and the fact is we can sideline that because this takes precedence over here.
Not only that, John, but you know, as you look at studies at the rate at which legend grew up in the ancient world, and you see that the passage of 2 generations of time wasn't even enough to wipe out a solid core of historical truth, which with legendary development. But you would expect after 2 generations of time, and down pike, you'd see more legend develop. Well, that's what Thomas is. It's legendary stuff. They didn't really care that much about the historical Jesus. They want to promote their own agenda of Gnosticism and self-knowledge and so forth. So it would make sense that in the 2nd century you begin to see some wacky stuff. Sure enough, we see some wacky stuff. But it's later. It has no direct relationship